Firstly, welcome. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Hannah Harris. I'm the CEO of Plymouth Culture. And you're joining us for a really exciting webinar. We're absolutely delighted to be able to have Jude with us today. And this forms part of a much longer, wider discussion we've been having in Plymouth as we move towards the development of a new 10-year culture strategy. We started that process pre-COVID as all conversations go at the moment. We started that before, and then obviously entered into the COVID world that we're living in at the moment. So I was just explaining to Jude that actually for us in Plymouth, that has afforded us some time to have a longer, deeper conversation about what the cultural strategy could and should do for us and what the core priorities should be in there. And actually COVID has usefully highlighted a lot of things that might have been on the margin and given us an opportunity to think about how we bring them to the centre. And so we don't want to lose sight of this moment in time actually being very relevant to what we move forward with in the future. And so we've taken the time to have some workshops and webinars such as this, obviously digitally, to just expand on some of those subject areas. So this follows on around our conversations around leadership and inclusivity, two themes that came out very strongly in our early consultation work with stakeholders, but that we really wanted to delve into and talk about what does that actually mean for us as a city and as a strategy, and what actions could we all take away in that space to make things different and change the outcomes that we might have in the city over the coming years. So I really welcome you all. Thank you so much for your time. This is a Q&A session, so Jude is going to offer us a talk in a moment, but we would encourage you to use the chat function to list your questions. We won't interrupt Jude with those. We'll wait for Jude to finish and then we will pose those questions, but please do put them into the chat as and when you think of them, and then we'll make sure that they get picked up in the Q&A session after Jude has spoken. So please feel free to send those through, and we'll make sure we monitor those to get them answered. I'm going to hand over now to Rosie, who's been a colleague of mine working on the engagement process for the cultural strategy development, to introduce both Arts Development Company and Jude. So thank you, Rosie. You'll need to unmute yourself, Rosie, because I muted you.
Okay, I've done that. Thank you. Thanks, Hannah, and good morning to everybody, and lovely to see faces that I've spoken to or seen in previous conversations. I'm Rosie from the Arts Development Company. We're based in Dorset, and my colleague Sarah James is with us, and we've been really enjoying this journey with you, and not least because the process is giving us fantastic learning that we are sharing with colleagues in Dorset and beyond. So today, as Hannah said, we're building on the previous conversations that we've had individually and the discussions, the provocations, and obviously thrilled and grateful to have Jude with us. For me, it feels like this is the time. Doesn't feel like, it is the time to act, to be brave, radical, demonstrate what leadership and inclusivity can really look like to shape a better world. And God knows we need it. So Jude Kelly CBE has an illustrious career. She's as a theatre director and producer, and a woman who makes things happen. Jude leads by example. She's constantly pushed for change. She influences, she shapes. Jude founded WOW, the Women of the World Festival that celebrates the achievements of women and girls, as well as being a man festival that addresses the challenges and pressures of masculine identity in the 21st century. The Arts Development Company is particularly delighted because WOW is supporting the Southwest Women's Leaders Transforming Leadership Programme funded by the Arts Council. And I'll put a link in the chat bar or send a link to Sabrina for people to be more aware of that, because that is coming up as recruitment is happening from now. Among many others, Jude's worked with the late, great educationist Sir Ken Robinson, who articulated so vehemently, didn't he, on the imperative for arts education. That's something quite close, very close to my own heart. And if you haven't already, I strongly recommend you listen to Jude's inspirational TED Talk on the importance of telling women's stories as part of human stories, of rewriting her history, championing women and girls as creative genii, and calling us to imagine and make a gender equal world. So, as a woman born in the same era myself, and I've experienced opportunities that my foremothers didn't, and I'm still desperately seeking for so much more change and equality for all, it's an enormous privilege to be introducing you, Jude, to everyone.
Thank you.
So be prepared to be inspired, to hear more on how we might change and lead to make Plymouth genuinely inclusive and to take action. Thanks. Over to you, Jude.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, everybody. And you know, it is a genuine pleasure, because you have to decide what tribe you belong to, and you know, you don't have to only belong to one. But I obviously belong to a tribe made up of people like yourselves who believe in the power of art and creativity to change lives, and obviously, you know, starting with your own. You know, we don't get involved in arts and creativity for money or status or prestige, or certainly not for security. But we do get involved because we know that the human imagination is so extraordinary. And, you know, I still think that looking at the history of the human race, the fact that the arts were there, like at the beginning, you know, the cave paintings is an obvious thing to say, but it's so primal. It's so much part of like what defines a human, the ability to shape story, present story, share story, and to do it through objects and narrative and sound and physicality is just the most amazing thing. And I suppose because, you know, like all of you probably, there came a moment in my life quite early where it got me. For the rest of my life so far, I've been pondering always the gap between the idea that if it gets you and it belongs to all of us, then why are so many people then encouraged to feel, well, it's not really for you, and you know, and not even encouraged to encounter a moment where it might get you? Why does that happen? So something that is like water and air and, you know, the kind of the natural environment, as in, you know, it's implicit in being alive as a human. Why have we managed to organize the arts formally so that it's top down and distributed in a kind of, you know, aristocracy to highly educated to, you know, to very solvent? Why does it work that way? And that's obvious, isn't it, really, which is that things that are mysterious and wonderful, things that have huge virtuosity in them, things that are precious, things that set you apart, tend to get kind of colonized, metaphorically or actually, and then held onto by people as an example of why they're powerful. And you can see all through history as well that because the arts encourages and gives you the chance to self-reflect, to rethink who you are and create so many windows onto so many worlds, you can see why most places of political power feel the arts are a dangerous commodity, like education, not to be given out randomly and to be quite carefully orchestrated so that people don't get ideas that will be difficult to deal with. So, you know, totalitarian states traditionally find it extremely hard to allow open arts access unless they, you know, they are kind of measuring exactly how it will be dealt out. And so when you find yourself in a situation of arts leadership, which all of you are, however you define leader, I mean, I don't think it means that you run an organization necessarily, but it means that you want to use the agency of your beliefs to create a different world, and you'll look for opportunities to do that. But when you find yourself in that leadership place, then there's several things that you can do, aren't there? That you can just be very glad you've got there and enjoy it, which is our prerogative, and then to do what is expected of you and make sure that you do that well, and that's certainly can be very productive. Or you think, okay, we're all the product of other people before us, a bit like Rosie was saying, we've got this far because other people got us education, other people got us opportunities, other people took us out of our peasant culture and into a different place, and we stand on those people's shoulders. What's the next job for us? And that's the bit that I find really exciting and really joyful, because I suppose unashamedly I feel that a life of service, I'm not a religious person, but a life of service to other humans feels good. I think a lot of people in the arts do naturally feel that. They want to contribute, and they want storytelling in any of these forms to be the way that they contribute. And that's why I think we've become rightly concerned over many years, like, well, whose story are we telling? Who's invisible? Is the arts replicating inequalities by carrying on lionizing certain kinds of people, certain kinds of stories, certain kinds of normalities? And if so, are we then part of the problem? And how are we going to be part of the solution instead? And all through my life, I grew up in Liverpool. My dad's one of 14 children, so I am the product of education of all kinds, reaching a stage where a woman like me would never have run the South Bank Centre 50 years ago, would never have run the West Yorkshire Playhouse. I am, and there's lots of women on this call, so and there's probably lots of, there may or may not be LGBTQ plus people who now feel they can come out and they can get married and they can have children. There are disabled activists who now feel as if they're perfectly entitled to ask for signing BLT, etc., etc. So there's lots of examples of us reaching a certain point where we feel we can claim our identity differently than we would have done 50 years ago. And I think the big challenge for all of us is, in the places that we work, and in your case it's Plymouth in the southwest, when we look at the landscape, can we kind of clearly see that the arts could do but isn't? Who are the people that the arts could mean something to but it doesn't? And what are the structures that are an impediment to that at the moment, and what are we going to do about it? We happen to be living in an extraordinary moment of global crisis, and I can only think that the Second World War was the other time when the world has looked at itself in this way and thought, shit, what are we going to do about the crisis, but also what are we going to do about after the crisis? And after the Second World War, which of course, was savage, barbarian, and mechanistic, deliberately, structurally so. So I don't think they compare in certain ways, because there's a kind of a horror of humanity that the Second World produced because of Nagasaki and Hiroshima as well, obviously the Holocaust and everything that happened in Russia. But so we're not horrified by humanity in that way at this point in time, but we are gutted by seeing how inequality is exposed. We're gutted and ashamed by seeing how it's not only exposed but deepened. We're worried by the chaos that many governments, particularly, especially ours really, aren't able to manage, because they haven't given proper tender thought to community needs. They haven't thought about what it's like to be a single mum trying to homeschool 3 kids. They haven't thought about domestic violence. They haven't thought about part-time workers. There's all these things that they haven't thought about, or worse, they have thought about them and thought, well, I don't care. And so I don't think we're going to have the equivalent of the United Nations spring up. We might not have the equivalent of the Declaration of Human Rights, which are the things that came out of the Second World War. But I think we will definitely have some sort of different kinds of reckoning. And, the war that's happening in parallel to COVID, which I suppose you could define as, say, Trump and Putin and Erdogan, the sort of the war for saying we still want to maintain a power-driven, top-down society. with kind of strong nationalism and strong white supremacy and so on. That war is being waged at the same time as COVID, and COVID in some respects is a kind of a camouflage for some of those things. So when we emerge to look at the economic debris, and we're probably just about to do that as furlough ends in our country, I think the issue of how we keep our own survival going, but then restructure what we're doing to make our communities more inclusive requires us as leaders to be prepared to have a lot of doubt for quite a long time, I think, because we're not talking about making a landscape that we know how to do. We're talking about another change of, I mean, inclusivity can't mean, well, everything I know and understand and I believe is going to remain the same, but I'm going to include some of you in it. You know, that's not inclusivity. That's sort of, I don't know what you call it, you know, versions of co-option into your worldview. What inclusivity means really is that we thought the pattern, the dynamic looked like this, and I, as a white middle-class person, let's just use it, that caricature for a minute, was standing in the middle. And actually now we're going to change all the chairs around, and we're going to include ourselves all differently. And that means changing the power dynamics. It means changing the decision-making frameworks. It means doing an awful lot of unlearning as well as learning. And we don't know how to do that, do we? I mean, it's like starting a whole pile of new relationships and then trying to work out how you make that work for yourself. And I think that, you know, so much of what we do, or so much of what we don't do, is because we're frightened. And this is a time, I think, when we have to step into spaces where we say we don't know how to do this, but we do know what it could look like at the other end. So, you know, when you're making a production or any piece of art, you know, sometimes you announce the title, you even start advertising on your website before you've even created the thing, especially with, you know, devised work. And you just, you know, you're sort of driven then by the fear of not letting yourself down because you've already announced it and people have even bought tickets. So you have to get there. And I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, making a claim that you will change the kind of diversity of an arts landscape by such and such a time. But then you've got to do it. You know, you've got to go into those difficult places and work very, very hard as to what that could look like. And I think that means, you know, sometimes quite difficult conversations. It means putting yourself on the line as a person. It means changing your friendship groups or expanding your friendship groups. And it means experimenting as well with what we've still got in our head about what excellence looks like, how power plays out and what power looks like. And you know, I can't pretend that this isn't quite tricky stuff. You know, just speaking about trying to challenge the idea of gender inequality, my feeling is that most of us, having been groomed to believe it and then play it out, you know, in our, like, from minute action to major action, most of us are pretty pleased when it gets a bit better. And you don't kind of go, yes, but it's not finished. Most of us just go, well, it's a bit better, so can we just leave it at that for a while? Because the act of like really recalibrating power structures is so hard, and it's full of people feeling that this doesn't sit right. So, you know, between men and women trying to get equality, it often feels like it doesn't sit right, doesn't even feel natural, because we're so used to accommodating each other's in different, you know, ways of being normal. And I think that when you start shifting the power so that you start co-curating the community, it often can feel, well, it's too difficult. and it didn't work, and we tried it once. If you really start saying, well, we're let's just say, we're going to take the opportunity of having closed various institutions for a while because of COVID, we're going to keep them closed for another 2 years on purpose, and we're going to use all that money to build audiences in a different kind of way, or build activities in a different way. I'm not suggesting this, by the way. I'm just saying that in order to think what could happen, you sometimes have to contemplate very different activities that you don't know how to do and aren't used to doing. But I don't know how else you can kind of build new worlds, except to say the bits of the old world that don't work, we are going to have to candidly admit it and then start dismantling it in order to make a new one. I'm not talking about absolute revolution, because I don't believe in absolute revolution. I believe in evolution. But I do also believe in speed. And this, for me, this COVID opportunity has raised, Liverpool, Norwich, all the conversations we're having all over the country are the same, actually, which is, even if institutions have developed policies of outreach and policies of education and policies of community participation, there has still always been a kind of feeling of, well, we'll kind of help you get where we've decided you need to go. And the idea of redistributing money from the other side, starting it in another direction and playing it back into the centre, it's very rare that you see that. So I think that as artists and arts makers and arts producers and creators, the conversation is about not only what we see exposed at the moment in terms of inequality, and therefore the excitement of inclusion in a different way, but whether the structures that we've currently got are an impediment to that, and if so, what are we going to do with some of our most sacred cows? So I'm going to stop there. I think that so that I can take questions, but I'm a white woman, I'm a white cisgendered woman, and it's taken me a long time, even though I have always been liberal, inclusive in my desire for inclusivity. It's taken me a long time to recognize that being white is a thing, and it's taken me a long time to realize that being cisgendered is a thing. It isn't up to me to include LGBTQ plus people. Would they like to include me? You have to think differently. It isn't up to me to include Black people. It's up to me to get out of the way and to dismantle some of the structures that other white people like myself have made happen, and not to put all the pressure on the minority power spaces to do all the work, and then eventually I'll include them. Because I know what that's like as a woman. You get given the task of solving everything from rape to childcare, and then eventually, when you've solved it all, you can have this equal world, apparently. But that's not possible. We all need to solve all of our world together. So that means that we have to know the people we're talking about. We have to have friendship groups across class divides. We have to have friendship groups across tribal divides. And as arts leaders, I think that is probably the most important thing, which is that you can't really take responsibility for telling different stories if you only know about those stories theoretically, if you only know about those stories academically. You have to know about them in your heart, because you have to become kind of a conviction person with those stories, because they matter as much to you as they can possibly matter, not because it would be nice to have. And I don't know how you can get at that sort of moment of empathetic passion unless something happens to you as a leader where you involve yourself differently with different kinds of people, different kinds of stories, and different kinds of circumstances. So it becomes your cause. And I think that is, I said I'd stop, and I think that is probably the most important thing. When people say, how can we be more inclusive? The number one is to care, to want to be, for it to be so compelling to you personally, that you will be personally ashamed, sad, and miserable if it's not, you don't want to live in a landscape that's not inclusive. That will make sure that you begin.
Thanks so much, Jude, there. That's, whoa, loads of stuff in there that, on a very personal level, I think what I heard was about how I need to think about my personal relationships as much as my professional ones. And so it's starting from within myself. And I was wondering, if we were to imagine that our organizations were starting again, what would you suggest might be a way in which one could do that? Because if I think about the Arts Development Company, and these are difficult times, that who knows what the future holds. You know, I think that's one of the questions that we're thinking about is, what are we here for? What if we were starting again? How would we do that? Is that worthy of thinking about?
Yeah, it is worthy of thinking about, of course, because by testing out, well, let's imagine, then you can find out, first of all, which part of your body resists this. You know, like whereabouts your stomach goes, oh no, I don't think we could do that, and why, you know. So you have to go to a place of scorched earth almost and start again in your head. First of all, to see why you're not there now, and then to kind of think which is baby and which is bathwater as well. And this is kind of part of the toing and froing of everything, isn't it? You know, if you think about the Cultural Revolution in China and how hideous it was to contemplate that, like, everything about the history was to go, all intellectuals, academics, creatives were going to go and work in the fields. You know, you're starting from nothing, but everyone's got to be equal. And we know that it was so reductive and brutal that it didn't result in anything that could be thought of as good. I don't think so. I mean, another webinar for another time. But so, and you know, sometimes like if you think what Black Lives Matter is doing at the moment and trying to say, you know, there are loads of things in the canon that you just can't present uncontextualized anymore. And I feel that as a woman, and it's very, very problematic, because you're kind of reinforcing all the time things that society has done and has believed, and then as a result people still believe it. So you can't, but you know, can you just like chuck all that out the way and start it over again? I don't think you can. Mm-hmm. And so you know, when I was artistic director of the South Bank Centre, I'm inheriting an organisation built in 1951. It had wonderful values when it was built, but it still carries with it, you know, many of the tropes and styles and ways of doing things that belonged to the idea of, like, this is what is proper, this is what the arts does that is proper. And I think the arts definitely is a kind of class gatekeeper. You know, definitely, you know, some people have finer feelings than others, some people have aesthetic appreciation and others don't. You know, it is very, very much geared to the idea that you have to sort of advance to the arts. And that's why we make such a distinction between, I suppose, popular folk culture and then, you know, high art, because it was a class definition as well. But anyway, the thing is, you know, when you are thinking, what could an ideal world look like? And you say, well, it could look like everybody participating and everybody's stories having relevance, including the kind of history of disadvantage. How do we get at that? I think it's really joyful to play around with what wouldn't be the case anymore and find out whether you could cope with that, and whether you wouldn't be able to cope with it because of nostalgia or because of a sense of like, that's not proper, or it just feels too difficult to dismantle, or whether it's actually for different reasons, you know, to do with, like, for example, I personally wouldn't like to dismantle the ability for a classical orchestra to exist. you know, I would hate to dismantle that, even though it's got various traditions that I don't enjoy. The experience of it and the thing of it is truly amazing. So I think it's like, I was wondering about baby and bathwater.
Yeah.
How do you keep the baby, but maybe get rid of a lot of the dirty bathwater that isn't useful anymore? That's why that's a helpful analogy.
Thank you. I mean, guys, I really urge you to stick some questions in here, and I'll keep going. I've got following on from that. I'm thinking about, you know, we can think about our own organisations and our own lives, and now I'm wondering whether you've any thoughts on how we influence policy making and that sort of bigger structural thing to harness and to do things differently for the benefit of everybody, because that, well, we know they make those decisions, and it's hard. Change is hard. I wonder if you've got any tips.
Well, I think, you know, there's two ways that you see big change happening. The power of one is very significant. I mean, we should never forget that, the power of one, because when a parent loses a child, you know, in horrible circumstances, whatever that might be, you know, there is so many examples of that parent turning themselves into an absolute kind of lion or lioness to lead, you know, a new law. I mean, look at Doreen Lawrence. I mean, look what Doreen Lawrence has done. And nothing would have brought her out of the shadows to do any of that, except a personal trauma that then went with the kind of sense of justice. And of course, a power of one then accumulates lots and lots of other people around them. But, you know, don't underestimate individually your personal power to make change happen, however, you know, in whatever place that you're in, because it's enormous if you wish it to be. And sometimes people have a lot of anxiety about that because they think, well, I don't want to put myself up there and I'm not trying to be special. And I interviewed a young 13-year-old activist the other day from Mississippi, who is a kind of refugee into America when she was 4, and realizes that the education system for people who have much less money, and particularly for who America is a second country, you know, the education was really poor. And so she's turned herself into a fantastic activist, but her parents said, well, who's got into you? You know, who's been influencing you? Because you were a nice, quiet girl, and now you're not. And she said, well, I am still a nice, quiet girl, but my voice is needed. And she sort of discovered this thing, like, my voice is needed. So first of all, you know, if your voice is needed, then raise it and make sure that you get over the worry that maybe you're standing out in the crowd and so on, because, you know, there's only one life and this is it. And you're in a place, probably all of you, when you can make more happen than you think. And then I think, as well as that, you can see from organising, the organising of Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter didn't happen because of George Floyd. Black Lives Matter has been happening in terms of organisation for a long time. Patrice Carson Cullors, who started it, or co-started it, you know, I think it builds on a lot of work. Obviously, it builds on Angela Davis, Audre Lorde. It builds on a whole kind of trajectory of work, James Baldwin. But it came into being as an organising structure about 10 years ago. And so, you know, if collectively in Plymouth and the Southwest, you think we want a different set of circumstances to happen, then just the dogged activity of getting together regularly, dreaming about it, dreaming is the most important thing. And then going, and we're going to stick with this dream. What should we do? How should we do it? Who should we influence? You know, that is how change happens. I mean, you referred to Ken Robinson, and we did the All Our Futures report together. And it took a long time. I mean, that's basically his life's work, all of that. And of course it gets knocked back by other forces. You know, the curriculum debates go to rage probably forever, but you have to be a force to be reckoned with around change making, and to do that collectively really is important. And I think one of the things that I'm worried about with COVID is that I think that compared to 25 years ago or 30 years ago, there is in the arts, a much more kind of agreed idea that education counts, that participation counts, that, you know, I mean, there was it used to be much more sort of, you know, high art doesn't discuss education and all this. And it's a much better ecosystem now than it was. But I think what COVID's done is it's revealed that it's still only got so far, and we're still sort of paternalistic, if I can put it that way. And I think that shocked people, and it's suddenly driven big schisms through the arts, because first of all, you have the freelancers all feeling as if they were suddenly kind of let go of, and they're in free fall, and they realize that they were kind of underneath the kind of grace and favor of arts organizations and institutions, but they never really belonged. And then you have everything that Black Lives Matter has exposed about our industry. But you've also got, I think, the survival of the fittest going on with grants, where institutions might go, look, for God's sake, just give me some money. I'll just, you know, try and keep going. Whereas at the same time, people are saying, yes, but we actually need a different way of looking at the arts, a different way of connecting with communities. And so I think that, you know, there's no easy answer to this, but what you can't do as leaders is sort of like just go, well, I'll just wait till it all kind of sorts itself out up there. Because that is not leadership. You have to go in and say, this is what my ideal looks like. How do we get there? And wrestle with that, including if you're in an institution, like wrestle with the fact that maybe you are being a difficult gatekeeper nowadays, even though you thought you were a young radical 10 years ago. You know, so I think open soul searching is an important thing for a community like this, an arts community, and seeing if you can create safe spaces for yourselves to have these conversations. You know, safe as in, will you look after each other while you all try to muddle through what the hell you think and how the hell you'd do it, even if you did think it. Because nobody knows how to do this next bit any more than people really understood, like, how do we give girls education? I mean, there's moments of human progress doesn't happen kind of like, oh, because it's simple. It's always like a massive muddle, but you do make progress.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hannah, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up on the question that Polly's put in the chat, actually, Jude. And you made a reference to funding a moment ago, so it's very relevant. Polly's been doing some work around sort of leadership and cultural partnerships, and is finding this sort of interesting dynamic around leaders sort of striving to make change or to do what they believe in, but then kind of being brought back to the traditions and expectations of funding requirements. I just wondered how in this radical leadership with us as creatives and organisations, we square that need for change with the funding landscape, and whether you would like to respond to that.
Well, I am beginning to wonder whether, talking about like the collective firepower of Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, I am wondering whether the collective firepower of arts leaders of the institutions and organisations that are going to get survival money isn't needed to sort of stand up and say to government, you can't ask us to be grateful and silent in the face of you telling us that we're not allowed to be activists for a better society. You know, I'm really worried that what's going to happen is that people are going to be sort of told to behave themselves, and the boards will tell them to behave as well. There's not an easy answer to this, but the conversation, you know, with the Royal Opera House, with the National Theatre, with Sadler's Wells, with the Plymouth Drum, you know, with all of these conversations where, Theatre Royal, you know, etc., have to happen with the most endowed arts leaders, you know, leaders who have been given money, resources and platforms. We have got to bring them all together and go, are we going to make a collective position here? Because it's only if that happens that people will be safe enough to carry on being brave. Otherwise, I can kind of guarantee that people will start going, well, I really can't kind of rock the boat. And that's exactly what the government have told us. Do not rock the boat. Okay, Colston Hall pulled its statue down. That's no more. And I think that's really, really worrying, because I think it will make us just, not trustworthy for the communities that we say we're serving.
Mm.
Yeah, and there's a real risk then it sort of preserves status quo, doesn't it? And that we're encouraged to do that from the funding streams.
I think it's deliberate. I don't think it's accidental.
Yeah.
I think the whole kind of culture war thing is a very real issue. And, and I think that obviously, government is going to be saying, well, we have got food bank problems. There's so many kind of calls on social services, if you like. There's so many issues revealed by COVID and then exacerbated by COVID. And I think that what the government are basically saying to the arts and culture sector is, look, could you just provide good news stories? Could you just make us feel that life is normal? We don't need you also wading in to kind of other areas where we just basically need to sort of calm everybody down and do whatever best we can. And so the Build Back Better idea, which is kind of coloured environmental conversations, it's coloured conversations about racial justice, it's coloured conversations about social equity. I don't hear the government talking about that at all. And I certainly don't hear them thinking, well, the arts is a great place to kind of reframe narratives. So let's ask them to tell different kinds of stories with different. I mean, of course, they're not saying that, but we must be.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think there's something about they're reframing their own narrative that they want us to think, and how we reposition ourselves or articulate those things. When you talked earlier about a life of service and giving, and I think there's something about, for me personally, there's something about that. What I was wondering is, if there was a specific sort of, what do you think, if you look back over your various roles, whether there's the most effective intervention that you made that increased inclusivity and brought different voices into that organisation?
Well, I can think of a couple that were difficult but significant. I mean, very early on in my career, when I started Solent People's Theatre, and obviously all of my work then was devised and based around issues that the community were dealing with. And I did a whole thing on travellers, and I'm not trying to sort of virtue signal here, by the way, but and there was a kind of big row at the time in Hampshire about travellers. And so I worked with, there's a company, worked with lots of travelling people and built this 3-part children's show with a real caravan that then got put to pieces and built, and bender tents and all sorts of things that were about the traditions of travellers. And the travellers, because they were so needed to do the show, became much more politicised in a sort of different kind of way. And they met up with the city councils of Portsmouth and County Council of Hampshire. They had different kinds of conversations because they were inside a cultural event. And it did change the conversations, both of the audience towards the travellers and the powers that be towards the travellers and the travellers, etc. And I suppose what that taught me, and I think it's still the case, is that if you want to talk about working with community of any kind, you have to show how you need them. Like, it's, we weren't solving travellers' problems. We were doing a show about travellers where we couldn't do it unless they taught us things and then we're included. And so we sort of needed to be there we needed their help to do what we did. And when I started WOW, I started these things called think-ins, which are still the basis of WOW, where I invite girls and women and boys and men, actually, trans and non-binary, to all come together in all different kinds of intersectional ways. And it's the intersectionality of the conversations where we're all co-learning. And I cannot do WOW without other people helping me know things I can't know and unknow things I thought I did know, or you know, and I can't do it. So I think the most important intervention as a leader is to sort of like be secure that the power you've got is power. There's no doubt about it. You've got power, but you can kind of put it to one side, really, and then say, what is the stuff that I don't know how to do, and start with interventions where you're bringing people to help you do something better, differently, rather than the idea that your intervention is that you've created a fantastic program that will kind of slot on top of a group of young offenders or a group of, you know, of young, because I don't think that psychologically is sustainable, because you know, you run out of the money, you run out of the program. But if you've started as a leader from a place of you are incomplete yourself unless you are constantly being helped to be different by your society, by you know, either it's your community, it's not the community, then even if things change, it isn't really about programs, it's about kind of your life's work. I know this sounds a bit evangelical, but nevertheless, you know, we are doing what we do because we're vocational people. It is what we are. It is who we are. So I think the most important intervention I can say is interventions onto myself, to do things starting from what I don't know and asking people who I want to understand the life of to help me do that. And then the second thing is, you know, we're often, when I've thought, oh God, this is going to be really difficult because people will think, oh God, she would do that, wouldn't she? You know, there's the stuff that you fear that people will feel is too edgy or too whatever. When I've just said, well, I think I need to do this, and I think we should do this, mainly people have gone, oh, that's good. We've been waiting for someone to do that, or, you know, we all agree. So I think that, like, that thing of, you know, feel the fear and do it anyway. My most useful interventions are ones when I've felt very frightened and then I've done it.
That sort of leads on a little bit to Sarah from Plymouth College talking about, and having been a theatre lecturer myself, it's that thing of letting go and how we are co-learning with students. How do we amplify young people's voices and concerns? And then what, you know, how do we sort of step back as leaders, because leadership is from behind as well as from the front, I think. I don't know if you've got any advice for universities and colleges on that.
Well, you know, I think Sarah's here, isn't she, from Plymouth Margin University? I wouldn't dare to give any college or university any advice. I can only give you my sympathy for, like, really tough landscape at the moment. Most people don't know young people. You know, after a certain age, you might know your children. Well, they won't talk to you anyway, probably. And you might get some good conversations with their friends. If you are involved in education, of course, you will then be talking to young people. But most people don't really know many young people, I don't think. And that's an issue. You know, like, what's your friendship group? How does it expand? Can you have young people as your friends? I'm really interested in that whole idea of how do you sort of change your life in order to mirror, you know, the art you want to make, or the creative processes you want. If you want inclusivity, do you live inclusively yourself, or do you just think that's a professional thing? I don't think you can do something professionally that you aren't doing in real life. That's what I basically feel. But in terms of young people and their voices, I think what is wonderful about human progress is just as we wouldn't, I mean, none of us 100 years ago, well, 110 years ago, none of us in this room would have had the vote, because I'm thinking that all the men would have come from kind of, well, maybe not all, but if you weren't part of the aristocracy, you didn't have the vote. So when women, except black women or women who didn't own property, so that's much less women than you think. I mean, much less women got the vote than you think they did, but the first lot of women got the vote, and then it sort of incrementally went on. And the reason that all women couldn't get the vote at that time was because all men didn't have the vote, and they couldn't make all women have the vote at the same time as all men, because that would have been equal, and they weren't going to do that. So all men got the vote when some women got the vote. And so that was like working men finally got the vote. And working women didn't. It was another seminar. But the thing is that we still have graded, you know, children should be seen and not heard. Women should be seen and not heard much. Working men should doff their caps. So all of that kind of idea of silence and deference is very, very driven into society. And of course it stops with children who are invisible, seen and not heard, or not even seen. And they suffer hugely as a result of their lack of rights, hugely. And I think that what we're seeing emerging is the rights of the child that we've been fighting for a very long time. And the right for a 10-year-old to have a voice, or a 12-year-old to speak about climate change, or a 13-year-old to speak about education, those are recently won rights, psychological rights. And I think that it is an amazing thing to watch young people emerging, suddenly experiencing their right to their voice and insisting on being heard. And they are as legitimate as anybody else in terms of their voice. And I think we adults often struggle with that idea, especially because we kind of have another whole parallel activity of parenting and educating, and therefore which requires some levels of, you know, cooperation. So we do struggle with all of that. But nevertheless, I think the kind of idea of building alliances with young people in this moment when they feel so excited about a better world, I think it's brilliant for us. And we've probably never been in this landscape before. We are, for Day of the Girl, a week on Sunday, we're bringing together 40 activists from around the world who are between the ages of 13 and 18. And they're absolutely incredible. You know, it's sort of like gobsmacking what they're doing. And then we're doing a kind of Sunday at 6 o'clock, just listening to various young people's interviews. I'll send you some links anyway, if you're interested. But I mean, I think the most inspiring thing at the moment is that young people assume that there will be a better world. It's just irritating not to have got there. But they assume that that we will. And that kind of stamina and energy that goes forward can carry us all a long way.
Thanks, Jude. We've got a couple more questions, which I'd love if you're okay to stay with us and answer those. I appreciate we might lose some people if they have to head off, but so there's two questions. One is around partnerships. So Alex from Beyond Face is asking around what do you think the fundamentals are for partnerships around inclusivity? And then we've got a second question, which is a different one, but feeds off of what you've just spoken about, Jude, which is your view on the kind of role of a woman as a mother and caregiver, and sort of how that puts them at a disadvantage potentially in terms of commitment and career progression and perceived ability, and what your view is around that and how we square that in terms of us as a future-facing city.
Okay, well, actually, it's a funny sort of way I can kind of join the questions up in a sense, because I'll start with the second question first. You know, lots of I mean, the idea of bringing children into the world should be a partnership activity, shouldn't it? It should be a partnership activity between the people who decide to have the child, and it should be a partnership activity between the idea of child rearing and society, because this is how we have societies. And the fact that it is left largely to the woman to solve all the problem is, I mean, it's a calamity for women still, to be in that situation. I'm not talking about, you know, the joy of being a parent and all the things that I've experienced myself, because that's another thing. But the actual financial hardship that all women are asked to sort out, or even if you wouldn't call it hardship, but definitely, you know, changes in financial circumstances, the juggling of the hours, the sorting out of the career progression, it's so unfair that society has given it to women as an unpaid activity and just said, well, you solve all of that. And no matter how much in partnership with you know, a husband or a partner or whatever, somebody goes, well, I'm quite hands-on, or I do my bit, the psychological idea of women owning child rearing and it being their job, that is something that I think is deeply flawed, and carries with it whole ideas of being free labor, basically. You know, that's it. It's free labor to raise society, and certain kinds of ideas about how guilty you are if you don't do things in certain ways. And it needs a lot more discussion, and it needs a lot more discussion in the arts, because in the arts, people are not interested in children and babies. You know, we women, and I speak as a mother and a grandmother now, were basically encouraged to sort of not go there. All right, it's not like you have them if you're going to have them, fine, but don't go there as part of the kind of cosmology of the arts, because the arts is so predicated on the idea of a sort of image of the creative process that doesn't include all that mess of children. And also, you know, the idea of a dedicated artist with, you know, doesn't think about hours, doesn't think about food, just does it. Doesn't go with the micromanagement of children either. So I think we have a sort of problem in the arts of not taking childcare any more seriously than anybody else. And it's a big burden on women in the arts. It's going to be a burden on men in the arts if they take parenting very seriously, but it's less of a burden because it's less of a kind of smear on the idea of their creativity. Right? Again, another seminar. But I think there is a relationship as well between unpaid caring generally in the home and how that's then translated into when you go into somebody else's home, whether it be a care home or, you know, whatever, that all those workers are very poorly paid, because we basically don't think anybody should get paid for doing all that stuff. We just don't value caring in terms of the economy. And why I think it relates to partnership is because lots of partnerships are built around, you know, around who's got the biggest power in the relationship, and therefore what they expect of each other. And so often, you know, when you go out with somebody quite wealthy and somehow you find you've offered to pay for their coffee, and, you know, and that happens a lot. There's a sort of feeling that you've got to sort of step in and look after them. You know, I think often in the power dynamics of partnerships, the smaller partner is often kind of grateful or feels that they should be grateful for being a partner. So they do more hours, they do more work, they get less pay, they do, and, you know, and they don't get the benefit of being made to feel that their expertise, their lived experience, if you like, is absolutely critical to the other partner in the same way that they ought to. And it's the same thing really about inclusivity. So I think that partnerships need to, again, be what do we need from each other as people, apart from just organizations, and how do we get rid of our sort of statuses? You know, you can't carry the status of your organization into a room and legitimately say that you believe in kind of the truth of the arts. You have to carry your own simpleness of yourself into a room, and you happen at the time to be the artistic director of the South Bank Centre, but then at other times you're not. You're just not. So you know, and are you a different person? No, you're not. So I think that partnerships need to examine power very carefully while they're being constructed, and part of kind of leadership is to not carry that power as part of your kind of cosmetic apparel. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Jude. That's fantastic, and a really interesting way of viewing those two quite what might be perceived as different subject areas in kind of one. We have come to the end of our session with you. I, for one, know that we could go on and pick up on lots of the threads that you have mentioned there. So thank you so much. It's certainly given me, and I hope everyone else, a lot to think about in terms of what we can do. And I think really positively, Plymouth is very, very well placed to be able to respond to some of these challenges now, not just because of what we have in the city, but because of the people we have here and the energy that has been building for years. This is not just something that, you know, we're deciding to do in 2020. There has been groundwork laid for years and years in this city, and we just need, as you say, to actually value that and recognise that, put it on an equal footing, and then imagine what might be possible. So thank you so much for highlighting that to us and giving us, I hope, the confidence to build a strategy out of these conversations that really truly reflects the ambition I know that sits in this room. So thank you so much for your time, Jude. We're going to make this recording available to people who are here today. I know that I, for one, will definitely want to listen back and pick up on those points. And we will hope that we will do justice within a culture strategy to reflect some of those really key changes that we want to see made as well. So thank you everyone who's joined us today and who's participated in the conversation. We will keep you updated on our next steps and really appreciate the time and energy you've given to the discussion today. Rosie, do you want to come in and say something?
I wanted to add one final thing, which is around the program of workshops that we might be following up, that we will be doing a bit later on, but also because I think we should be willing personally to come back and say, what's the change that I've made as a result of these webinars on a personal level? I mean, I'd be prepared to do that, obviously pledging. Just that sense of this, the action that we take at a personal and therefore how that impacts on our professional work, because I feel quite strongly about that.
Yes, great. Thanks, Rosie. And we can pick that up in our later workshops around the strategy and people's personal action and commitment to that. That's great. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We'll leave it there and hope to speak with you all very soon. Thank you so much for coming.